Alright, me. So today, I just finished reading The $1 Billion Spy by David E. Hoffman. This is a nonfiction piece detailing probably one of the most important espionage missions that the United States ever took on in the closing days of the Soviet Union. It details the espionage of one Alfred Tokolchev, who ran and was an informant for the CIA directly under the nose of the KGB. As discussed within The $1 Billion Spy, right? There's this thing in which, when you look at like espionage, the majority of times the people who commit espionage and commit treason in that way are directly related to military operations, right? And it's usually because, you know, objecting to the way that the military is being used in some way, which, you know, is right in a lot of ways, because you should, right? I would argue that if you don't like the way that something is being run, especially if it is aggressive in a way that you don't like, right? But Alfred Tokolchev was very unique in the sense that, you know, in an area and at a point in time in which the USSR was very compartmentalized and did not share a lot of information between certain channels. It was very unique because Alfred Tokolchev was a designer and an engineer, right? And he did not have any direct military affiliation. He just designed and engineered things, which meant that he had then also had access to all these other documents of information and things like that, right? And it is because of Tokolchev, or is it Tokolchev, that the MiG fighters that were used in Iraq and in the Middle East in the 1990s were so easily defeated by US planes, right? It was because of this espionage that took place in the 70s and 80s that then allowed for complete air dominance in those areas in the 1990s by the Americans. The $1 Billion Spy really is one of those things that we're like, it certainly is. Yes, I see you, cat. I'm aware of you. You can be up here. It's one of those things where like certainly there's this issue of like, we have to frame it in a certain way to make ourselves look better. Because one of the things that you know constantly happens, and happens again here, is that we openly praise and discuss how positive and how great Alfred Tokolchev is, because he is betraying his own country in the USSR to then give information to the Americans to then take down the USSR, right? And it's described that this is because both Alfred and his wife Natasha, their families greatly suffered in the original Soviet takeover of Russia, right? And so they get a lot of praise for that, right? Which is rightfully so, right? So the way that, unfortunately, the communist and Stalin regime ruled was not a very positive one. But then we also see what the betrayal at the end is, right? In that Edward Lee Howard, I believe his name was, became a spy against the United States, right? Where he was someone who's trained for the CIA, was given access to all these secrets, and then was at the very last second refused a position and was basically forced to resign, but without being given any sort of support, right? And so, and he's framed completely as the bad guy in all of this, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, well, why is one good and one bad? Well, it's because one inherently helps our sense of duty and our sense of country, and one is against us, right? Yeah. Talking about, you know, the Alfred and Natasha's despisement and antipathy of the USSR, right? It's because they both came from families that were greatly destroyed during the communist takeover, but then also, you know, continue to be personally attacked by it, right? By having no sense of freedom in what they get to choose to do, by not having, you know, just simply being told that because you're good at X, you need to do X and Y. Or even within, even if you enjoy those things, right? You don't necessarily get a choice on what you do with those things, right? Versus the US situation, right? Which it does a lot of the same things, right? Of where like, hey, if you're good at X and Y, you need to do X and Y because that's how you make money and that's how you get paid, right? And that's how you can survive. But then when we sometimes get to choose things like with Edward Lee Howard, and then those things don't go well, or we get suddenly removed from them, right? There's no fallback plan, right? There is no reassignment. It is just a force of removal that gets you nowhere. But yeah. Really, like, looking at, this is my commentary on war now, I guess. It's this constant fight of like, we are gonna sacrifice our current generation for hopefully better life for future ones, right? I would argue that is the, at most simplistic form, why war happens, right? I would argue that in a lot of ways, right? You can take the economic approach and Marxist approach and say that it's all for resources. You can say that you can take really what has become the American approach and call it for ideology and things like that, right? But at the end of things, right, it is so that we are sacrificing our current generation so that our future generation can become better and have a better life. And what I think often gets skipped over in all of that is that, well, that means that your future generation has to also agree with the way that things are being done and things are being run. And that is certainly not always the case, right? And Natasha and Alfred Tolkachev are a perfect example of this, right? In which they are given, they are forcibly raised in this effectively lost area, because they don't have the independence that their ancestors had and that their forefathers had, but also they don't get the benefits and the hope, I should say, the hopeful benefits that their future generations have, right? They're caught in this middle of rebuilding and reconstruction, and it just gets taken down and is destroyed, right? And because of that, and because of that anger and frustration of being effectively abandoned, right, they commit espionage against the USSR. And the same thing happens to Edward Lee Howard, right? Of where he gets, he's promised all these things, he becomes privy to all this information, and then is abandoned, right? And it's because of this what he feels as a betrayal towards him that he commits treason and espionage against the United States, right? Yeah. The Billion Dust Fight also goes a lot into, you know, how these operations were run, which I think is really, really interesting. Because we talk a lot about, you know, we see a lot of spy and espionage media and, you know, things of that. But really, what it comes down to is an action-based thing that has some sort of stealth involved in it in some way, right? We think of spies as being either James Bond-esque or like Metal Gear Solid-esque, right? Of where you are sleuthing in certain areas that you shouldn't be in, and you're trying to be stealthy and covert, right? Versus this, where it is a lot of, I'm just existing in my normal everyday life, except I have a camera and I'm taking pictures of things I shouldn't do. And then I'm going to meet in a car or meet in a park with someone for 20 minutes and exchange goods and leave, right? So it's I think a very interesting look into the way that espionage is actually done versus what we envision things are like, right? Yeah. Is there anything else to talk about with the $1 billion spy? Oh yeah, I guess the other thing, right, is that, right, with the frugalness of our countries in order to get information, right, is both in the American capitalist system as well as the USSR communist system, right? The USSR communist system is the fact that they simply just don't have money, right? And so they can't pay informants what they're worth, versus the US capitalist system, which is like, you know, you constantly lowball for the lowest offer that you can give someone, right? You know, the bid, you know, project go to the lowest bidder kind of deal. And what you see is that, you know, Alfred Tokolchev, his information and his espionage and, you know, all of his rolls of film and pictures that he took, you know, saved the US billions of dollars, right? You know, upwards of, you know, if you really consider it in the immediate research and development, roughly $1 billion. And that doesn't include, you know, things that were involved with the Gulf War and the Persian War and things of that nature, right? So you're really looking at upwards of like $3 billion that Tokolchev provided to the United States in espionage. And he gets out of it, you know, some Western records, some Western pieces of media, some banned books, $1 million escrow account that I don't think ever gets cashed, right? And then roughly, you know, a couple $100,000 in rubles, right? Because the escrow account, right? Tokolchev gets arrested and then executed very, very quickly, right? It all happens within a matter of days, effectively, right? In which he suddenly gets taken, and Natasha as well suddenly gets taken, and then goes to prison. And then the son, Oleg, I don't think gets as involved in all of this, right, in all the aftermath, right? But so like the US military or the CIA, you know, for billions of dollars worth of information has effectively cost themselves, you know, $1 million or so US dollars, right? And paying for it, right? And that's not necessarily including, you know, the things of the training of the CIA officers themselves, or their effective salaries, or, you know, things like, you know, the technology that they built, right? But you're looking at a pretty nice exchange rate for the US and the CIA in terms of, you know, what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And the money that they make back on Tokolchev. But yeah, that's the $1 billion spy, David E. Hoffman. It was fantastic to read it. It took me a couple days to read it because I was just, you know, not really in a reading mood, but that's that.